Jesus was confronted by a generation of people who were unbelievers, skeptical. We've read on two separate occasions that the leaders of the Jewish people, the leaders of the community, came to Jesus, having seen everything that Jesus was doing and having heard all the stories about the incredible ministry that he was carrying out and conducting. And on those two occasions, they come to him and say, "Give us a sign. Prove to us. Do a magic trick for us, Jesus. Then we'll believe that you are who the people claim you are, who you claim you are." And twice Jesus rebukes them. But actually, we've just read two of those. But it wasn't just two. There's at least a third one, because Matthew records a second incident. And let me just read you a few of those words too from Matthew chapter 12. And here he explains the sign of Jonah. You might have been wondering in our Matthew reading when Jesus said, "No sign will be given to this generation except the sign of Jonah." What is the sign of Jonah, you might ask? We all know about Jonah getting swallowed by the big fish because he was disobedient and ending up being put back on shore, and God giving him a second chance to go to the city of Nineveh and to tell them that God's judgment is coming and to repent before it does. But Jesus finds himself in Matthew chapter 12 being confronted by a faithless people again. From verse 38. Then some of the Pharisees and teachers of the law said to Jesus, "Teacher, we want to see a miraculous sign from you." He answered, "A wicked and adulterous generation asks for a miraculous sign, but none will be given it except the sign of the prophet Jonah. For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of a huge fish, so the Son of Man will be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. The men of Nineveh will stand up at the judgment for this generation and condemn it. For they repented at the preaching of Jonah, and now one greater than Jonah is here. The queen of the south will rise at the judgment with this generation and condemn it. For she came from the ends of the earth to listen to Solomon's wisdom, and now one greater than Solomon is here." Jesus rebuked these teachers, the religious leaders of the people who gave guidance to the ordinary man in the street, the ones who the ordinary man followed and called them rabbi, meaning teacher. And he rebukes them because they kept coming up to him again and again and again and saying to him, "Okay, if you really are this one sent from heaven, do a miracle. We want to see something right in front of our very eyes." Now, you might ask the question, what's wrong with hard evidence? We live in an age where we are taught that unless you get hard evidence, you should be very skeptical. So science rules the day. And unless something can be proved scientifically, it's still only a theory. And we need to prove that theory. And so we spend great amounts of time and money and resources. Lots of energy goes into proving theories. Why? Because we want the truth. The problem with that is that, of course, that as it's been proved many, many times over, that as soon as science says it's proved something and it's this is exactly how something happens, only a few years later, very often, someone comes along and says, we can now add to that knowledge. We can add to that knowledge because we found out something different. The things that we thought were so are no longer so. Let me give you an example with electricity. We've had electricity around for quite some time. And in the early days, we always thought that electricity flowed from the positive to the minus. Now we know it actually flows from the minus to the positive. But science proved that it flowed positive to minus. So how is it then that later on science then disproves what science has already proved? Because actually, science can never be 100% accurate. There's always something more to discover, and that's one of the wonders that we find of this creation that God has made for us, is that there is always something deeper, something more to find out. I get fascinated with science programs and nature programs and things like that, and I remember watching a program looking at some of the deepest oceans that we have around the world. And as they sent this device down, because no human could go down there, they sent this device down, 6-7 miles down under the water. And they were discovering new species of fish that nobody knew had existed. And there on camera for the very first time, there were these things. And they made the point that actually there is more to be discovered under the oceans than we have already discovered on land. Now, that's only a theory. We don't know, of course, what's under the oceans. We haven't discovered it yet. We don't know how much is to discover down there. But what we do know is that we have never found the very depths of everything. And if we were to go out in the opposite direction and go out into space, we're still probing galaxies which are, millions of light years out there. And we don't know what is out there. And of course, we get some who are still looking for life on other planets. I think they're going to be looking for a very long time, if you ask me. But we can't be sure of anything. So why should we trust, therefore, the things that people say? Now, I've used examples from science, but it's not just science. There's also lots of other theories or philosophy that goes around. And there are people who come up with their philosophies. And, we live in a society that runs in a certain way because of the philosophies that have guided us and have brought us to this place. And we think it's the right place to be and the right thing to do. It's Churchill, wasn't it, who said something along the lines of democracy is democracy is the worst kind of government ever devised, except every other one. And it's true. It's not actually a good form of government. There's an awful lot that's wrong with it. But we haven't come up with anything better. Or have we? You see, Jesus was angry with the teachers of the law, those who studied the Scriptures and taught the Scriptures, because they didn't recognize that the Scriptures were indeed the Word of God. They didn't recognize that all truth was contained in the pages of the books that they looked at day after day. They read them constantly. They knew them better than anybody else around, yet they didn't understand. They were ever seeing, but they were never perceiving. Ever listening, but never hearing. They couldn't take it in. It was too much for them. Because this is not a human book. This is the Word of God. And so what Jesus is saying to these people, he's saying, you come to me looking for signs? He says, everything you need has been given to you already. You are meant to be a people of faith. You are the children of Abraham, you claim. John chapter 8, you'll find there that Jesus enters into quite a discourse on this whole business of being the children of Abraham. And they defend vigorously, saying to Jesus, "We are Abraham's children. You know, our father is Abraham. Our pedigree is perfect." But Abraham was the father of all who have faith, not those who can trace their family line back to him. And Jesus says, that's more important. Faith is what counts. And now these very people who claim to be the children of the father of faith are showing they have no faith, because they have read their scriptures and yet they have never seen Jesus in their scriptures. And yet it was so plainly obvious that it was him standing before them. Everything about Jesus' life was there contained in the scriptures. All they had to do was just look for themselves. We've just been looking, we're just out of Christmas, and we've been looking at some of the prophecies and having those familiar words read to us again. How is it that 30 years earlier they knew that Messiah would be born in Bethlehem, but nobody thought to come to Jesus and say, "Jesus, where were you born?" That would have been a starting place. "We know that you're Jesus of Nazareth. Were you born in Nazareth?" No, Jesus was born in Bethlehem. Where will Messiah be born? In Bethlehem of Judea. What about the miraculous signs that he performed? Well, again, we have there within the scriptures, it tells us quite clearly that Jesus is going to be such an incredible miracle worker and teacher, and so many characteristics about his life are contained there. They knew that. Why did they need more evidence? Why did they need it before their very eyes? Wasn't it enough to have so many people coming saying, "We've been healed"? So many witnesses around saying that this person was deaf and now they're hearing. This person was lame and now they're walking and running and jumping. You see, their own law said that you establish everything by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. That's all you need. When they came to crucify Jesus, they brought, finally, having had lots of false testimonies about Jesus, but they couldn't find 2 that matched. And finally, 2 people came up with the same testimony. This man said that he would pull down our temple and rebuild it in 3 days. And that was the charge. They said, "We've got him. At long last, we've got him." 2 people who've given the same testimony about him. False testimony, in a sense, because although Jesus did say those things, there was nothing malice in that. But they took it and they twisted it. So these people were quite prepared to say then, "We'll take at the word of the witnesses." But now they've got not just 1 or 2 witnesses or even 3 witnesses, but there are dozens and dozens of witnesses, people coming along saying, "This is what Jesus has done." And still they come to him and say, "We want to see a miracle before our very eyes." But Jesus also rebukes them, not just because they asked for a miracle which showed they had lack of faith, but I think he rebukes them also because even if he did do a miracle before their very eyes, he knew full well that they still wouldn't believe. Their hearts were hardened. They were callous deep inside. There was nothing going to get through to them. If they saw a miracle before their very eyes, they would have said it was a trick. If it happened today, the first question they'd have asked Jesus is, "Do you know David Blaine?" Or something along those lines. How did he do it? It's a trick. We can prove that because when Jesus did do a miracle before their very eyes, they said, "It must be a trick." or at least will tell the people it was a trick. Again, we have to go to Jesus' death, the end of his earthly ministry. And the people came, some of the teachers, they came and they said to Pilate, they said, he's crucified, he's dead, he's in the tomb, but we remember him saying that he was going to rise again. So Pilate said to them, will you go and make that tomb as secure as you know how? Take some soldiers with you. No one is going to get to that tomb. And yet actually Jesus did rise from the dead. The stone was rolled away. The soldiers were terrified. They came back and they reported everything to the chief priests and the teachers of the law. And the teachers of the law didn't say, it's a trick. They believed what the soldiers said and said to them, here's some money. Go and spread this rumour around that someone came in the night and stole Jesus' body. And if it gets back to your superiors, we will cover for you. We'll make sure you don't get into trouble. That's not the sign, is it, of believing that Jesus' body had actually been stolen. That's not the sign of saying these soldiers are just making it up. That's not the sign of believing that it was some kind of trick. These people knew that a miracle had been done effectively before their very eyes. The security that they had put in place appears to have been breached, but that was not possible. They have a testimony from the soldiers who explained everything that had happened, and they knew that it was real. So they had to spread a rumour about Jesus instead. See, Jesus knew that even if he performed a miracle in front of them, even if he had raised a person from the dead before their very eyes, they would not have believed it. And so Jesus says, there is no sign going to be given you, except the sign of Jonah. For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the fish, so the Son of Man will be 3 days and 3 nights in the earth. Now, technically, we could argue he wasn't there 3 days, 3 nights. But we won't get into how the Jews calculate their days and nights. The point is, as I've just shown you, that when Jesus did do the sign in front of them, it was at that point where he was in the earth. He was there for that time and then came back to life once again. The problem is, and Jesus warns his own disciples about this, because on another occasion, Jesus is challenged by these Pharisees, probably a different group this time. Once again, the same question, show us a miracle, do something before our very eyes. Jesus, disgusted at them, jumps in the boat and heads back across the lake with his disciples. His disciples in the boat have 1 loaf of bread, and Jesus says to them, and he warns them about these teachers of the law, be careful of the yeast of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. The poison that they spread. That little bit of poison that grows and gets through the whole batch of dough till every part of it is affected. Now the disciples, being a little bit dim-witted as they sometimes were, sat there thinking that Jesus was literally talking about bread. And they're muttering away to one another and saying, Jesus is telling us off for not going to Tesco's first, because we didn't pack the picnic. And Jesus couldn't care less about the bread. And he says to them, you've got 1 loaf of bread. How many people do you think I can feed with 1 loaf of bread? Looking back, I used to think that my mother was incredible, that she managed to feed so many people with so little and still have so much left over at the end. It's a bit like a Merton Park party, really. We often say, don't we, that we cater for the 50 and by the end of it we could feed the 5,000. But this was a real miracle that Jesus had done, where he took just 5 loaves of bread and a couple of fish and fed 5,000 plus with all of that. And Jesus says to his disciples, do you think I couldn't make this one loaf of bread go round? There's 12 of you, and me 13. That's if they were all there. Do you think I couldn't do that when I fed thousands upon thousands with just a few loaves of bread? Do you think I'm really bothered about that? See, Jesus is saying, I could do a miracle before your very eyes. Not that he was going to, because he didn't have to. Whereas the teacher of the law demanded a miracle, Jesus' disciples didn't need that. You see, Jesus doesn't say to his disciples, give me that loaf of bread. Now, let me tear this up. You have a piece, you have a piece, you have a piece. And once he's gone around saying, everybody else, a bit more, and a bit more. And, finally, the boat starts to sink with the weight of the bread that's in there. He doesn't do that. I'll tell you what he does instead. He says to them, think back. Think back. I don't need to perform a miracle. Think back. What have I done in the past? Is that not enough for you? So why do you have so little faith? And that's been the principle that God has always used with his people. We found that in Psalm 107 where we began our service this morning. And we find it in a number of the other Psalms and in other places too. That God's people, when they needed encouragement, they didn't say, oh God, show us a sign. They said, look back at what God has done. Look back into our history. See the faithfulness of God. How he cared for our needs. How he brought us out of captivity. How he defeated our enemies. How he fed us when we were in the desert. How he gave us water when we had nothing to drink. Think of the greatness of God in the past. Why should we doubt him now? We do not know how God is going to deal with us today. We do not know what tomorrow may hold, but what we do know is that God has never let us down in the past. He is a faithful God. And Jesus is saying to his disciples, don't let these Pharisees and Sadducees, the teachers of the law, put little seeds of doubt into your minds. Because that's what they do. They go around to the people sowing the seeds of doubt. He isn't really the Messiah. He didn't really do those miracles. This person wasn't really blind. They just had, a bit of dim sight maybe, but they weren't really blind. This person wasn't totally deaf. This person wasn't actually dead. Or were they? And you see, that's the thing, is that into our minds, seeds of doubt are placed. And we find that even to this day, that there will be many people around who are trying to put seeds of doubt into our minds. Just as you're feeling strong and standing on God's word, somebody will come along and say to you, how do you know the Bible is true? How do you know that God really exists? How can you be so sure that God really does love us? Why, if God is so good, does he allow such terrible things to happen? See, these are all seeds of doubt. Now, what are you going to do with those seeds of doubt? Are you going to allow that yeast to work through the whole batch of dough? Are you going to allow it to permeate through, to reach every part and to create doubt within you? Or are you going to say, hang on a minute, I reject that. Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees. Are you going to reject it and say, no, I'm going to stand on the word of God, for every word of God is true. Every word he speaks is true. Nothing he says will ever fail. It is the only thing in the whole of this universe that is guaranteed. We look to things that are stable, and we try to base everything on our stability on those stable things. So, for example, we believe the sun is stable, relatively speaking. It's consistent. Therefore, the earth also rotates in its orbit, which is consistent. And therefore, we're able to tell the times of the day. We're able to know the seasons of the year. We're able to count the days through because of that consistency. But if we were to look very closely, we'll find that the sun isn't quite as consistent as we believed it to be. We are being told that the sun is actually burning out. I don't think it's going to burn out in our lifetimes or the lifetimes of the next few generations, so don't worry too much. But, we're told the sun can't actually burn forever. That would be an impossibility. I believe that to be true. The sun is not eternal. We're told that it will disappear one day. We're told that the earth, although it spins at what seems to be a consistent rate, and although it goes around its orbit in what seems to be a consistent rate, that's not actually quite true. And so actually the days are not precisely 24 hours long. They do vary just a little bit. But God's word is absolutely sure to the last very detail. So Jesus is able to say in Matthew 5, not one little bit of the law will ever be removed. The jot or tittle, as some of you may know it. The dot and the iota. Not one will be removed from the law, says Jesus. I've come to fulfill the law, not to remove it. Everything of God's word stands absolutely firm. And so we must be careful not to allow the thinking of this world to penetrate into our minds. In other words, we have to look at what is going on around our world, and we have to make decisions and judgments on what's happening through the lens that is God's word. Does it fit with what God says? And if it doesn't, then we have good reason to say there's got to be something wrong. Now, let's be careful. The Bible is not a scientific manual. It was not meant to be a scientific manual. It never will be. But it is still God's word. And that's why we have to put effort into understanding and interpreting it. Why we have to dig deep sometimes, and we have to delve around and find some of the background stuff for it as well sometimes, which helps us to understand. That's why we're grateful to those who've taken the trouble to learn original languages so they can help us as best as possible to come to a very clear and consistent reading of the Word of God. Every word of God is true. And as we go into this year with all the uncertainties that are there, and we do not know what's going to happen, we cannot guess accurately as to where this year will finish up. There is one thing you can be sure of, and that is that when we stand on God's word, then he will be faithful. And usually the times when it seems that God is failing us is not so much God failing us, but us failing him. So we need to be careful. It's not always the case. There are times when God allows us to go through tests and trials, but he tells us that he does that so that we're strengthened. He does it ultimately for our good. But whatever happens in this year ahead, what I want to encourage you above everything else is to trust in the Lord for everything. As individuals and corporately as a whole church. We've got to trust him, we've got to believe him, we've got to know his word, and we've got to stand on it firm. Let's just pray.